the true wakia of Akub Latki and her babe's betrayal. The night descended like a black funeral shroud. No moon. No stars. Only the wind's mournful moan through the rotting thatched roofs of an outskirt village, miles away from the main town. Beneath those slouched, frozen rooftops, a flickering oil lamp struggled to stay lit, tired, like a soul unable to cross over. In a cramped room of a dilapidated hospital, a man named Sadiq collapsed to his knees on the cold tile floor upon hearing the news his wife had died during a difficult labor. The grief was so immense it paralyzed every reaction. A nurse gently placed a blood-streaked, red newborn in his arms, umbilical cord still fresh, eyes unopened, yet her cries pierced through the deepest layers of reality. Sadiq stared at the baby girl as if looking at a verdict. She took my wife away," he muttered. Yet still, he held the child to his chest, instinctively, as if clinging to the last strand of survival. The funeral was held in silence. No one wept aloud. Only the wind moved between gravestones, and the white mourning scarf of the old widow Sadiq's mother fluttered into the air and fell slowly like a belated goodbye. In the early days, Sadiq tried to care for the baby. But love, within him, was like a puddle evaporating under the heat of hatred. When his sister refused to take in baby Arzu, calling her a bad omen, a child born of death, Sadiq did not argue. He simply took her back in his arms, eyes hollow of light. He named her Arzu, meaning wish. But deep inside, he no longer believed in anything. Time passed like the wind whistling through cracks in the door. Arzu grew up under the care of her grandmother, the only one who never called her cursed. Meanwhile, Sadiq withered. He worked at a small pharmacy. At first, he was diligent. Later, negligent. Eventually, he grew accustomed to the burn of liquor and the artificial calm of stolen sedatives. On monsoon nights, when the winds beat back against the creaky roof, Sadiq would lie down, staring at the ceiling, as though waiting for someone to call his name. But no one ever did. Only a voice echoed inside his head, a voice bleeding from memory. If she hadn't been born, my wife would still be alive. It was no longer a whisper. It was a declaration. A father's indictment of his own child. When Arzu turned 13, her grandmother died from a severe asthma attack during the winter. As the white cloth covered her face, Arzu didn't cry. She had grown accustomed to loss the way others got used to the smell of cooking smoke. With no one left, she was forced to live with her father, a man she saw only once or twice a year. A man who looked at her like a scar that would never heal. "I just want to know, why do you hate me so much?" Arzu asked one day while clearing the dinner bowls. Sadiq didn't respond. He only exhaled sharply and drained his glass. He had heard those questions 1,000 times in his mind. But no answer could make him feel less like a monster. That winter was so cold, villagers said it could freeze even fire. Arzu fell ill. She couldn't stand, her skin flushed red with fever, lips cracked and dry. "Dad. I feel like my body is burning," she whispered. For the first time in years, something flickered in Sadiq's eyes. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the pharmacy where he once worked. He returned with an old vial, unlabeled, mysterious. No instructions. He injected it into Arzu's arm like some strange doctor, half careful, half desperate. She fell asleep almost immediately. That night, Sadiq watched her sleep for hours, his expression unreadable between regret and calculation. A week later, Arzu recovered. But her body began to change in strange, inexplicable ways. She didn't ask questions because her father never answered anything about the truth. Every time she fell ill, he would give her another special dose. And every time, she grew faster, stronger, as though time inside her was being sped up by an invisible hand. What she didn't know was that the door of karma had begun to creak open, not in a rush, but slowly, like a fire smoldering in dry straw. That night, a tiny spark lit within the human soul. No one saw. No one heard. But in the invisible realm of cause and effect, it was all recorded. Every act, every thought, every evasion of truth is a seed planted in the black soil of karma. And one day, it will sprout and bloom, in pain. Not all demons have horns. Some wear tattered caps, drink alcohol, and call themselves father. Arzu sat by the window, the coarse curtains swaying gently. She looked outside at a winter sky, gray and cold like a mat laid over frost. A strange feeling rose inside her chest, anxiety, or perhaps an instinctual sense that something was changing inside her very flesh. Her back ached. Her heart raced faster than usual. Once again, her body was transforming in ways she couldn't understand. And as always, the only person with answers lay sprawled across the bed, reeking of liquor, snoring hoarsely like wind scraping against rotten walls. Her father, the man once known as the brightest young man in the village, now resembled a cracked clay statue, hollow of the man he used to be. She couldn't recall how many times he had injected her with those fever cures vials without labels or names, but every time, something in her changed. Her body matured. Her face glowed unnaturally. Her chest throbbed with something that didn't belong. Arzu didn't understand it, but she knew something was wrong. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw someone else. No longer the little girl who once clung to her grandmother on stormy nights, but a stranger, with deep eyes and sculpted cheekbones like wax. The cracked mirror in the corner of the room seemed like a silent witness, reflecting her abnormal transformation, though no one ever spoke a word. That night, her father came home looking different. He wore a clean shirt, freshly shaved, walking with the poise of someone expecting an honored guest. He even knocked on her door, voice loud and enthusiastic. "Daughter, make a nice dinner tonight. We have company. An old friend, he used to adore you as a child." Arzu froze. The house hadn't heard friendly voices in years. But the way he said it sent chills through her. "Adore me as a child." She racked her memory but couldn't recall any such friend. When the guest arrived, her confusion turned to dread. A man in his 50s, wearing a polished suit, cologne so strong it smothered the house's age-old mustiness. His name was Javed. And when Arzu brought out the food, the way he looked at her froze her in place. It wasn't the look of a family friend. It wasn't the warm gaze of an uncle who once gave her candy. It was the look of a predator. As if she were a carefully wrapped package. So this is Arzu. My goodness, she's grown fast. Doesn't even look the same anymore. Javed licked his lips and smiled. Her father smiled too. But it wasn't a father's smile of pride, it was sinister, calculating. The smile of someone who just sold something precious. That night, Arzu didn't sleep. Curled under an old blanket, she listened to the wind howl against the fence. Outside, her father and Javed talked in hushed voices for a long time. She didn't hear the words. But she understood with the intuition of someone who grew up in silence that a deal had been made. And she was the thing being traded. When Javed left, her father walked him to the edge of the alley. When he returned, he whistled a first light. Pleased. Like someone who had just sealed a lucrative deal. The next morning, he brought back another vial and told her to inject it like always. She wanted to refuse. But his eyes made her fall silent. Not angry. Not affectionate. Just empty. Like a man who no longer recognized right from wrong. She took the needle, closed her eyes, and injected it into her arm, ignoring the chaos pounding in her chest. As the drug took effect, she drifted off. In her dream, she stood before a dry well. Inside were faceless figures, reaching out for her. At the rim stood a black silhouette dressed like her father, pushing her, step by step, toward the abyss. She screamed. But no one heard. And she fell. When she woke, Arzu knew one thing. If she didn't leave this place, she would be buried in that darkness forever. There are places where lights stay on all night, yet darkness seeps into every rooftop tile, every forced laugh, every handshake reeking of cigarettes and alcohol. The small town where Arzu lived was one of those places. The people weren't necessarily evil, but they were far too used to looking the other way whenever something made their chests heavy. They heard the crying. They saw the swollen eyes of a child walking alone to the market in the rain. They knew the father often visited gambling dens. But they stayed silent. Because what good would speaking up do? Because they were too busy. Because it's not our business. Arzu grew up under gazes that were half pity, half curiosity, and half coldness. She no longer hoped anyone would speak up for her. After her grandmother passed, she became a shadow in her own home. Her father Sadiq changed day by day. Not because he aged, but because it was as if he was slowly becoming someone else. He would leave in the afternoons, dressed neatly, and return late at night with crumpled paper bags Arzu never asked. She knew that if she did, she would only receive that same cold, gut-wrenching stare. One day, while cleaning a cabinet, Arzu found a small notebook wedged between the wooden panels. No name. No dates. But inside were rows of numbers, notes like 3,000, last month's meds, J, appointment on the 10th, A, prepare stronger dose. Her hands trembled as she reached the last page. It held only one sentence: next month, the girl will be delivered. Everything is ready. No signature. No trace. But she knew. Everything that had been a blur now came into sharp, brutal focus. She said nothing. Didn't cry. She walked out to the backyard well, the one where her grandmother used to wash wool sweaters in winter. She knelt, placed a hand on the well's edge, and closed her eyes. The cold wind slapped her cheeks. The water reflected a figure, not her father, not a trafficker, but herself. Yet the eyes in the reflection weren't hers. They were her mother's. The eyes that had looked at her one last time before leaving this world in the delivery room with a final breath and an unfinished goodbye. That night, Sadiq didn't come home. Arzu didn't wait. She locked the door, lit a candle, and sat reading that notebook from cover to cover. Each line was a blade carving away the last slivers of hope. Some entries described dosages and bodily changes in chilling detail, as though he were studying a specimen, not raising a daughter. Every word was cold, detached. Not a single line hinted at love. The next morning, a neighbor knocked asking for a bit of sugar. Arzu opened the door, face composed. The woman around 50 stared at her. "My goodness, Arzu, you're becoming so beautiful. Surely someone will come for you soon. You don't look like the other girls your age." Arzu smiled faintly, an expression that never reached her eyes. She poured the sugar, nodded politely, and went back inside, her head a storm. Compliments now felt like claws brushing against her skin, not joy, but an omen of something to flee. That afternoon, Sadiq returned. In his hand was a small bag. He didn't look at her. Just said, "We have a guest tonight. Make something nice." "It's someone familiar." She nodded. Looking at him was like looking at a corpse that still talked. She no longer trembled. Fear had been replaced by a strange stillness, as though a part of her soul had detached from her body. She cooked. Set the table. Cleaned. Washed cups. Like a machine. When Javed arrived, Sadiq welcomed him with glee. They laughed. Toasted. Drank. But Arzu heard no laughter. All she saw was Javed's hand holding the wine glass, his eyes never leaving her, not even for a second. That look calculating, appraising, like selecting merchandise from a dim-lit shop. She knew, tonight might be her last in this house. Or rather, the last in this body if her soul failed to escape in time. She washed dishes. Tied her hair back. Took the trash to the yard, then sat by the stove. It was long extinguished. But she remained, not knowing where else to go. A dog passed by, skin and bones, a reflection of herself. She looked at it. It looked back. Then vanished into the dark. Then she heard a door creak open. Her father's shadow appeared. She turned away. But he called, "Arzu, come here. I have a gift for you." She stood, not because she wanted to, but because she knew she had no choice. She walked, like a sleepwalker, toward him, the man who, by now, she knew was no longer her father. They say some nights are dark not because the moon is missing, but because darkness has soaked into the hearts of men. That night, Arzu's house didn't lose power. But the kitchen lamp flickered like the erratic breath of a dying flame. Inside her, every second passed like an invisible hand tightening around her neck. Sadiq sat at the table, tapping his fingers on the wooden surface, waiting. And Javed, the uninvited guest, was in the other room, removing his coat and rebuttoning his shirt like some ritual he'd done many times before. Arzu stood in the kitchen, tray of tea in her hands, feet glued to the cold tiles. The smell of alcohol, cigarettes, heavy cologne all mixed into a nauseating fog. She didn't want to enter. But she had no choice left. Her hands trembled not from fear, but because her body already knew, tonight, every boundary would be torn open, including the last one, her trust in the man she once called father. The living room door opened. Javed's gaze swept over her like a scanner assessing new merchandise. Her father said something, maybe a joke, that made Javed laugh. A dry, echoing laugh like stones dropped in a deep well. Arzu placed the tray on the table. She didn't look up. Didn't respond. She didn't know who she was in that moment, a servant? A gift? Or a witness to a crime committed in the very place once called home? When her father stood and said he had an urgent matter and that Javed should rest here, Arzu didn't need more words. The truth was as clear as polished glass. Sadiq left, not hurried, but relaxed. Like a man who had just closed a transaction. She stood still. Javed approached, his voice softening, but his breath growing heavier. "Don't be afraid." Your father agreed. "We'll just talk." She turned her head. Her mind screamed. Her heart pounded like war drums. Then, something strange happened. She didn't run. Didn't cry. But behind her, the window tapped. 3 times. Soft. But distinct. She turned. The latch was unlocked. When she opened it, cold air rushed in. Outside, bathed in pale moonlight, stood a familiar figure. None other than her father. Sadiq. trembling in the wind, eyes staring at her with something different. "Come," he whispered. "Quick. I'm here to take you away." Arzu couldn't believe her eyes. He had just left her for Javed. He had just walked out like a deserter. So why was he back? "Quick, before he notices," Sadiq urged, waving, desperate to preserve the moment. She hesitated. Instinct told her not to trust. But her heart, the one still bruised by hope, pulled her toward the window. She jumped down. Her feet landed softly on damp grass. No words were exchanged. Sadiq grabbed her hand and rushed her toward a small car parked nearby. On the way, he whispered, "Javed's an old friend. But long ago, I owed him a debt I couldn't repay. He demanded US payment." He sighed. "I thought I was already dead inside. But when I saw your tears, I realized, there's still something human left in me." Arzu didn't speak. She sat curled in the car. Outside, tree shadows slid past like silent witnesses. The car left the town, turned down a dirt road, past the last houses. All was quiet. No one chased. No one noticed. As if the disappearance of a girl was something nobody cared about. She dozed off in exhaustion. When she awoke, pale light trickled through the window. The car had stopped. She rubbed her eyes. Ahead stood a row of unfamiliar buildings. Not a hotel. Not a house. Not anywhere she'd ever seen. Tiny rooms stacked side by side. Balconies draped with colorful scarves. Laughter floated from an open window, not children's laughter. Women's. And in those sounds, she sensed falseness. Like a carnival of lost souls. She turned to her father. "Where are we?" she asked, voice dry. Sadiq didn't reply. He stepped out. Opened her door. "Get out. This is a safe place." But in his eyes no warmth. No remorse. Only weariness, and a hint of regret. Like a hunter delivering prey, still bearing the wound from his first kill. Arzu stepped out. The smell of cheap perfume and makeup stung her nose. Women on the balconies watched her, smirking. One said something she didn't catch the words. She didn't need to. She understood the feeling. She hadn't escaped. Her father, the one who once led her through darkness, had simply delivered her into a darker one. Not just out of guilt, but because betrayal had come, dressed as salvation. If you're still watching this video and feel moved by the hardship Arzu went through, please comment the number 2 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I highly encourage you to hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell so you never miss a video. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. The Red Room. Arzu didn't know why they called it that until she stepped inside. The walls were painted the color of dried blood. Crimson silk drapes wrapped around a large wooden bed. Under the yellow light filtered through sheer fabric, everything looked hazy and unreal, like this place didn't belong to the living world. The air was thick with the scent of old lipstick, stale powder, alcohol, and sorrow that had lingered behind closed doors for too long. The woman sat in the corner in an old armchair. Her black hair was pinned tight, her eyes lined thickly, lips red like coagulated blood. She wore a velvet sari embroidered with golden thread that shimmered like snake scales. When Arzu entered, she didn't rise or greet her. She simply looked her up and down and gave a soft, icy chuckle. A laugh of amusement and ownership. "Pretty," the woman said, voice hoarse like a half-burned cigarette. "Still fresh." untouched. A rare piece. Arzu froze. Her ears rang. Every word from the woman hit her like a slap. She turned toward her father Siddiq standing at the threshold, unable to meet her eyes. He bit his lip. His hands clenched as if grasping something in the air. But he said nothing. No explanation. No apology. No embrace. Just silence more terrifying than any scream. The woman stood, her perfume trailing behind her like a dying memory. "How old?" she asked, fingers brushing Arzu's cheek. Arzu recoiled. 14, Siddiq answered flatly. "But, she looks older." The woman smirked. "She does. Look at that body. Must be the drugs. You did well invested, right? They love girls like this, young, but ripe. Innocent, yet enticing." That sentence shattered the last thread. Arzu stepped back, then screamed. "I'm not a product. I'm human. I'm human." She cried out, each sob like a blade slicing through her chest. But neither adult moved. One laughed, the other hung his head. No one came to hold her. No one tried to stop her cries. Because, to them, she had stopped being a child long ago. Siddiq turned away and left the room like a man afraid of his own shadow. Arzu collapsed to the floor. The woman calmly poured tea, as if the outburst had been nothing more than childish drama. "Cry," she said evenly. "Let it out. It'll be easier tomorrow. Girls like you always do. First night they cry. Second night they requiet. Third night, they smile. No. I won't stay here." Arzu shook her head violently, eyes red. "I'll escape. I'll scream. I'll run, and someone will save me." The woman set her cup down and crouched to meet her gaze. "Who will save you?" she whispered. "That town? The people who watched you walk alone? That neighbor who said you're looking prettier every day? Or your father, the one who signed you away like selling a car?" Arzu couldn't answer. She sobbed not from pain, but from despair. "But I'll tell you something," the woman continued, and for a fleeting second, her eyes softened, not cruel, but mournful. "I was once like you. 14. Believed someone would save me. But then I learned, if you don't save yourself, no one ever will." She turned away, opened a door to another room. "Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, I'll teach you the rules." When the door shut, Arzu remained alone in the red room. She didn't cry anymore. She had no tears left. Only her heartbeat. And the dry ticks of an old wall clock. Wind slipped through the small window, dragging moonlight like silver tears. She stared at the ceiling, whispering something unclear. Maybe her mother's name. Maybe a prayer. Maybe a farewell to who she used to be. Some seeds don't sprout right away. Karma doesn't punish with knives to the throat. It seeps in, slow as water through stone, soft as a sigh turning into cold wind. And then, one day, when the one who caused it all thinks they've escaped, the will of samsara turns. Quiet. Without warning. But mercilessly precise. Siddiq left that house like a smuggler fleeing after a dirty deal. He didn't look back. Didn't check if Arzu fell. Or cried. Or bled. In his pocket was a fat wad of banknotes, enough to start over, move elsewhere, drink better liquor. He didn't care what Arzu might be thinking. To him, the deal was done. On his way, he stopped by a roadside bar. Old. Dim, tired, like a woman who's forgotten how to sleep. He ordered a drink, sipped it slowly, alone. No voices in his head. No image of the girl who once called him father with what little trust remained in her soul. Just the clink of coins in his pocket and dreams of a future without the burden called Arzu. But tonight, the liquor tasted different. Not bitter. Not warm. Cold. A chill that slid from his throat to his gut. Cold like a blood stain that never dries. When he stood, he stumbled. Not from alcohol, but because across the road stood a woman under a street lamp. The light hit her hair, making it swirl like smoke. She didn't move. Didn't look at him. But Sadiq knew. Instantly. It was Arzu's mother. His wife. The one who had died in childbirth. Her face was pale. Not angry. Not sad. Just looking at him, asking a question no one else could hear. "What did you do with my daughter?" He rubbed his eyes. When he opened them, she was gone. Only the cold street lamp remained. And wind slapping his face. He rushed across the road toward home. And that exact moment, a delivery truck barreled in. No horn. No brakes. Just a single, blunt sound. Like flesh hitting pavement. Sadiq was thrown like trash into the middle of the road. Screams erupted. People ran. But when they arrived, all they saw was a shattered body, blood pooling like a crushed flower. His hands still clutched the money. No one knew who he was. No one knew what he had done to a child's life. Far away, in the red room, Arzu sat curled in the corner. She didn't know her father had just died. Didn't know karma had moved forward in ways no one expected. But inside her, a wind stirred cold, yet calm. As if an invisible chain had finally snapped. She didn't cry. Didn't tremble. She just sat. Breathing softly. For the first time, since being brought there, she felt peace. That night, it rained. On the roof, water dripped like silent Buddhist chants. The woman in the red room didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, fingers counting old prayer beads, ones she'd kept since she was a child, when she still knew prayer and hope. "This girl, she's not like the others," she whispered. "She won't stay long." The next morning, while the house slept after a wild night, Arzu slipped out the back. In her hand was a small piece of metal sharpened from the old iron bed frame. The back door was locked. But the lock was old. And her hands, no longer shook. One click. The door opened. And in front of her the alley, leading to the main road, and a gray sky. She didn't look back. Didn't run. She walked slowly like someone waking from a long nightmare. Her bare feet stepped through puddles, leaving behind prints tinted with blood from a cut on her heel. But she didn't feel pain. Only one thought rang clear. I'm still alive. Dawn hadn't fully broken. A soft mist lay over the town like morning silk. Arzu walked through that morning with no direction, no name, no one beside her. Just a bleeding heel and a soul that had escaped hell. Not a hell of walls and chains, but of betrayal. She didn't know where she would go. Every road looked like an arm hiding a knife. Every house another potential trap. But instinct pulled her one way. Toward a home that once opened its doors when her grandmother was alive. That house, small, old, moldy, tucked between two larger buildings, was where someone had once wiped her tears with a sleeve and called her the daughter of a good woman. As Arzu knocked, the sky began to drizzle. The woman Aunt Bilkis answered in a wrinkled housecoat. Her face froze at first. then melted like rain sliding down rooftops. No questions. No explanations. She pulled Arzu in, held her tight like a child returning from a flood. "Oh God, where were you? Why are you covered in mud and blood?" Arzu didn't speak. Couldn't. She lowered her head, tears falling onto the woman's hand. Each drop was a piece of her nightmare finally released. Each one another part of the past she had buried in silence. Aunt Bilkis didn't press further. She washed Arzu with warm water. Gave her old clothes from her daughter. Cooked a bowl of rice porridge with scallions. While Arzu ate, she sat quietly beside her, occasionally stroking her hair, the way a mother does after a nightmare. That night, for the first time in months, Arzu truly slept. No dreams. No terror. Just real sleep, wrapped in warmth, the scent of a familiar kitchen, and the hum of wind through the porch. In her dreams, she saw her grandmother holding her hand, walking through a green field in the breeze. When she looked back, the red house was gone. The next morning, news of Sadiq's accident spread. A man hit by a truck during the night died instantly. No ID. No one came to claim the body. He was buried in a cemetery for the nameless dead. Arzu heard it from the newspaper boy. She didn't cry. Didn't sigh. Just silence so complete Aunt Bilkis had to look at her for a long time. "Do you want to see him one last time?" she asked. Arzu shook her head. "He died a long time ago, only the body followed later." Aunt Bilkis understood. She didn't ask again. From that day, she became the keeper of Arzu's remaining light. Not with sermons. Not with pity. But with presence. By never letting her eat alone. By giving her the room with a window facing the garden. By asking her son Samir to bring her books. Samir was Arzu's age. Kind. Quiet. He studied at a nearby technical school. The first time they met, he asked, "Do you want to read The Blue Bird?" Arzu looked up, confused. "It's a book," Samir explained, "about two children searching for happiness." She nodded. From then on, every afternoon, he brought her a book. She read. She wrote down the lines that hurt the most. And those that warmed her like spring sun. A month passed. Arzu began to smile. Just a little. But it was real. She helped Aunt Bilkis cook, clean, garden, sew. And for the first time in her life, she believed maybe, just maybe, she could live like a normal person. But light doesn't come without cost. And the past, no matter how far we run, always finds a way back. One afternoon, as Arzu hung laundry, a strange man appeared at the gate. White shirt. Slick hair. A stranger's face, but a familiar look. The look she'd seen in Javed. The look of traffickers. He didn't enter. He just stared. For a long time. Then turned away. Arzu clenched her fists. Her palms damp with sweat. She knew. The rain had passed. But the storm may still be coming. There are wounds that seem closed until a passing breeze makes them bleed again. There are memories thought to be buried until a glance turns the body to stone. The man in the white shirt that day didn't enter. He said nothing. But his presence alone, the way he studied every movement Arzu made, as if retracing a missing shipment, was enough to fracture the fragile piece she had only just begun to rebuild. That night, Arzu didn't sleep. She lay under the blanket, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Every sound from the yard made her heart jump, like a bird startled by a snapping twig in the forest. The ghosts were no longer memories, they were there, at the gate, watching. The next morning, Aunt Bilkis said, "Yesterday, a strange man came asking for a girl named Arzu." Arzu stayed silent. Her face showed no emotion, but the spoon in her hand trembled slightly in the teacup. Aunt Bilkis understood but didn't press. She only sighed softly. "If something's wrong, you have to tell me. Don't keep carrying it alone. Even trees break when they bear too much." Samir glanced at Arzu a long, questioning look. But she didn't meet his eyes. Because if she did, she feared she would cry. She would speak. She would let it all spill out. And if that happened, the fragile light she had just found might shatter again. That afternoon, while hanging clothes, she heard footsteps behind her. Not Aunt Bilkis' slippers. Not Samir's familiar steps. These were leather shoes, steady, slow like the ticking of a countdown clock. She turned. He was there. The man from before. The same cold gaze. One hand in his pocket, the other holding a half-smoked cigarette. His mouth curled into a smirk. "I was right. You really are here." Arzu didn't scream. She didn't run. But her grip on the laundry basket strap turned pale with pressure. "You made us search everywhere. Old Siddiq's dead, huh? And you ran." His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to stop the wind. "Leave," Arzu said quietly, but each word fell like stone. "Don't think you're free. 1 month and you think they'll forget? Girls like you don't get to choose." She clenched a wooden clothespin in her hand. Small, but sharp. And more importantly, it was the only weapon she had. She stepped forward like a cornered cat, hissing low. "I'm not merchandise. I don't belong to anyone." The man frowned, stepped forward. But Samir's voice called out behind them, "Is something wrong?" They both turned. Samir stood there, book in hand, gaze sharp as a blade. The man glanced at Arzu, then shrugged. "Old business. Just checking on someone. Keep walking." "There's no one here for you," Samir replied, unmoving. The man scoffed, nodded, and walked off. But as he disappeared, Arzu knew it wasn't over. Men like him don't stop when prey still breathes. They don't fear laws. They don't know conscience. They stop only when their grip is broken by something sharper than knives, resistance. That night, Arzu told Aunt Bilkis everything. Every detail. From the first injection, to the Red Room, to her father's death. Aunt Bilkis listened without interrupting, without shock. Just sitting still, holding Arzu's hand until the last word was spoken. "You didn't deserve that," she said, voice breaking. "No one deserves that, Auntie," Arzu replied, lifting her chin for the first time. Samir had been listening from the doorway. When Arzu saw him, he didn't look away. No pity. No disgust. Just a nod. A silent promise. "From now on, we'll face things together." And in that moment, Arzu understood, this time, if the storm returned she wouldn't face it alone. Some nights bring no rain, no wind, no thunder, yet inside, a silent storm brews. And if we can walk through that storm without breaking, that's the first moment we truly grow. Arzu woke earlier than usual. Something inside her had changed. No longer gnawed by fear with every breath. No longer haunted by dreams of the Red Room. Only clarity. Like sunlight piercing glass after rain. I'm no longer a child for others to shape my fate. She sat down for breakfast with Aunt Bilkis and Samir like any other day. But no one asked, "Are you okay?" There was no need. It was in Arzu's eyes. Aunt Bilkis simply placed a hand on her shoulder, gave it a gentle squeeze. "Today, do what you need to do." And what she needed was to stop running. That afternoon, Arzu left the house, scarf wrapped up to her chin, wearing Aunt Bilkis' old cloth cap. She walked slowly along the old market street. The same path she once took as a barefoot child, carrying a basket of vegetables. Then, she had been invisible. Now, she was a shadow of a different kind. Walking among crowds with resolve sharp as a blade beneath her coat. She stopped in front of a roadside tea shop. According to a girl who had once escaped like her, it was a known spot, where traffickers gathered. No loud voices. No names called. But if you sat long enough, one would come. To watch. To call your name like a favorite order. She sat. Ordered ginger tea. Placed her hands on the table, eyes steady, watching people through the steam. And just as she expected, he came. The man from before. White shirt. Half smile. He pulled out a chair, no asking. No permission. Sat down, crossed his legs, and said quietly, "You think you're smart enough to hide forever? The money's been paid. You're a lost asset. I'm just here for retrieval." Arzu didn't blink. Didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of tea. "If I'm merchandise, what are you? Courier? Or just a dog?" He snorted, shook his head. "You've got guts. But guts won't save you from people out of patience." "Maybe not," Arzu nodded. "But I have something you don't." "What's that?" he sneered. "Witnesses. Testimonies. And cameras." In that moment, his face froze. His eyes darted. And then, from both sides of the street, two plainclothesmen approached. Undercover investigators following Arzu's statement from 3 days earlier. Samir stood across the street, pretending to buy a newspaper. He never took his eyes off her. "You're under arrest for suspected involvement in a trafficking ring. Please come with us," one officer said, showing his badge. The man resisted. Cursed. But it was pointless. His hands were cuffed. His head lowered. Before they took him, he turned back to Arzu, snarling through clenched teeth. "You'll pay for this." Arzu met his gaze. The same eyes that once silenced her with fear. Now, she stood tall like a tree after the storm. "I've already paid my part," she said. "What comes next is yours." As the police car drove away, she sat again. Took a deep breath. The tea had gone cold. But her heart was warm. Not with anger. But because for the first time, she had won. That night, in the kitchen, Aunt Bilkis hugged her, saying nothing. Tears fell on Arzu's shoulder, not out of grief, but relief. Samir walked in, placing a small cake on the table. "Happy birthday," he said. Arzu froze. "My birthday?" she asked. He nodded. "You're 15 today." Arzu laughed, truly laughed. Not because of the cake, but because she had lived long enough to know. From now on, each year of her life would be her own choice. Not anyone else's design. And that night, after everything, she went to bed. Without trembling. If you're still watching this video and feel inspired by Arzu's strength, please comment the number 8 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I highly recommend hitting that subscribe button and turning on the bell so you won't miss any of our videos. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire you. 5 years later, the small town had changed. The old dirt roads were now paved with smooth brick. The roadside tea shop bore a new sign. People who had once remained silent in the face of injustice now occasionally spoke out, not because they were braver, but because someone had once stood up first, leaving behind a firm footprint for them to follow. In a quiet alley near the local girls' school, there was a small room painted a soft yellow. A simple wooden sign hung above the door, "The House of Wind, a shelter for girls who have survived abuse." The house was modest. No flashy banners. But every day, girls arrived silent. Their faces blurred by tears, rage, guilt, and fear. And when they left, even if still silent, there was often something in their eyes. Delicate, yet real, hope. Arzu was now the one in charge of the center. She didn't like being called the founder. She would simply tell people, "I just relit a lantern because there was a time I believed I'd never see light again." She didn't share her past with every child. She didn't have to. Each handshake, each gaze exchanged, was like an invisible thread binding souls that had once been torn. Here, the girls learned to draw, to embroider, to read, to tell stories. But more importantly, they were heard. No one judged them. No one forced them to be strong. Because Arzu understood sometimes the bravest thing is being allowed to be fragile. One late afternoon, while organizing the small library, Arzu found an old notebook, its corner bent, pages yellowed with time. It was the notebook she used back when she lived with Aunt Bilkis, during the first days of reading books with Samir. Inside were quotes, scattered notes, ink smudged by tears. On the last page was a single line, in different handwriting, clearly Samir's. "If the light within you was ever extinguished, remember, you are the only one who can light it again." Arzu smiled. She knew her journey was still long. There were still dark doors not yet opened. There were still girls, just like the one she once was, trembling behind someone's closed gate. But she also knew she was ready. Not to rescue anyone, but to stand beside them like a lantern that does not go out. That night, after everyone had gone home, Arzu stepped into the backyard, where a small wooden wind chime hung. The wind blew. The chime rang soft, not sharp, but echoing far. She stood there for a long time, looking up at the sky, where a crescent moon floated like a promise. In that stillness, she heard a voice, not quite from memory, not quite from her heart. "Daughter, if one day you lose your way in the night, listen to the wind. It always blows from where your mother is watching you." Arzu closed her eyes, placed a hand on her heart, and smiled. She was no longer a victim. No longer just a survivor. She was alive, truly alive. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of Ruqayyah's journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to leave a comment below. Sparkles, share your thoughts, or a lesson you've taken from Ruqayyah's path. Folded hands, we deeply value your reflections. Each one gives us strength to continue bringing meaningful, human-centered stories into the world. Pushpin, if this video moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread these gentle lights across the world. We're grateful for you, and we look forward to seeing you in the next story.